um, welcome everyone here and say that, well, first of all, a couple of things. We are streaming this live from that source over there. And so folks around this table, if you could use your microphones when you do speak so that your voices are picked up for the streaming service. Also, we have installed a hand sanitizer over there for everyone needs to use today, and in addition to your elbow bumping. Today we're going to have a day, it looks like a full day here for our retreat with a number of presentations, but in general this retreat is focused on our budgeting process, highlighting our priorities as a council and folding those priorities into this budgeting process as we move forward. So this again is a pretty thorough deep dive that we're going to experience today. We have already had some budgeting meetings and work sessions, and we will have more budgeting meetings after this. But this isn't a day where we're voting on anything or taking any official action, but we will have opportunities to provide direction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, Deborah Campbell, who is going to begin our
So good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being good, no, just kidding. What I would like to do is to provide you with kind of a look back before we drill down into discussion. Will be working, so.
That's it, okay.
All righty, so here is the agenda, and the mayor has kind of gone over this. But what I would like to say is that this retreat is going to have a lot of information. And so we're gonna have lots of coffee, and we may even get chocolates. We just need you to stay engaged because, again, there's going to be a lot of information shared with you. You can see we have some guests that will be with us that we're calling kind of content experts. And then we're going to have staff provide the Asheville kind of perspective and situation. The reason that we wanted to kind of take a look back is because oftentimes we get so caught up in what we need to do next that we don't kind of celebrate and embrace what we've already accomplished. And when staff is looking at what we ought to be doing, we always go back to council's framework, your strategic priorities, the things that you value. And I don't think it's just council, I think it's the community, what the community values. And a lot of our work is focused in your strategic priorities around these focus areas: equitable and diverse community, transportation and accessibility, thriving local economy, connected and engaged community, well-planned and livable community, clean and healthy environment, quality affordable housing, and financially resilient city. What I would suggest to you is that these focus areas are generally not what I would say is mom and apple pie. I really do think that you all did a good job of thinking about what are the most critical things that we need to be focusing in on as we look toward 2030, 2036. This is a long-range view, and those issues and concerns that, again, you all need to focus on. What you did at your retreat last year is looked at, if we are looking long-term, doing a visioning and a planning process, how do we literally address these things from a short, midterm, and long-term perspective? And again, at your retreat last year, you identified in priority order these things that you wanted to focus on: implement transit master plan, even though number 13 is maintenance, new construction, and operational needs, we know that is an ongoing thing that we're going to do as a city. So I don't want anybody to think that number 13, maintenance, construction, and operational needs, was the last thing that was on you all's mind. It's equivalent. I think it's an overarching priority. And so what I wanted to do is just quickly go through a couple of things, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail with each one of these, but they are organized in terms of your focus areas. Equitable and diverse. We have been trying, as part of your council meetings, to bring you updates on the activities within these general focus areas. And you all just recently had one on equitable and diverse. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but just to highlight a couple of things: the equity collaboration in Asheville City Schools. And I hope what you will find is that with this long list of things, it's not a way that we are trying to pat ourselves on the back, but we know that there are lots more that we need to do, but we think we've made significant progress on a lot of these things, either being initiated, completed, or are well underway. Some of the things that we may identify also you had been working on for years, and we're finally either getting them to completion or, as I said earlier, well underway. We're pretty proud of the equity collaboration with the city schools because it has provided us with a stronger, relationship with the school system. Is something that city government generally isn't involved in. So we're pretty proud of the work that we are doing with a collaborative or collaboration of different organizations and entities within our community, talking about how do we address the opportunity gap. So much so that we have incorporated as part of our strategic partnership initiative, and this effort will be coming to council, I think in April, an entire focus area for our strategic partnerships that if you want to work with the city, you need to be addressing the opportunity gap. And you see the rest of the items. Transportation and accessibility, we will have a deeper dive related to transit, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this one, but you can see some other things that we are working on and doing as it relates to transportation and accessibility. Thriving in local economy, trying to address some of the business development and business inclusion efforts. Connected and engaged community. Want to just identify the noise ordinance, which actually wasn't a part of some of your strategic initiative, but was one that was added during the year. We'll be bringing that back to you also in April. Well-planned and livable community. Also, the hotel development study was not a part of your strategic priorities last year, but was added. And we, again, are well underway with that effort, and had the Urban Land Institute come in and help us with that effort. APD, Central District implementation, we are well underway with that effort, and also written consent policy. The Clean and Healthy Environment Initiative, purchased 5 electric buses. They're out running, and a number of things we will be having, again, more robust discussion around sustainability initiatives later on this afternoon. Quality and affordable housing. You all adopted a city-owned land disposition policy. We had a retreat. There are a number of things that hopefully you all are proud of as it relates to affordable housing initiatives. I touched my face, I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to do that, right? Financially resilient city. I'd like to really focus on 2 things that we're really proud of. The assistant city manager hire with Richard White, and police chief David Zach, and before David, we had some other hires. We had Chief Bailey and interim Chief White again. And now David Zach, who is in the audience. I kind of believe that that is the end of my presentation. Now we will turn it over to, well, before we do that, can you give yourselves a hand for all the great work that anything that you saw on that list obviously involved a lot of staff work, community work, but also elected official work. So at this time, I will turn it over to our facilitator, Ed Manning. He has done a lot of retreats throughout the state and probably the country, and was the facilitator for your retreat last year, and he's going to come up and kind of give an overview of today's work. Thank you.
Good morning. How are we this morning? Cold if it's on, hot if it's off. You know, we'll get there eventually. So you can just tell by everybody putting on their jackets that it's not the cold day, so we might turn it back up. Welcome, and thank you for having me back. I really appreciate working with you. And first and foremost, just want to say thank you. I don't know that you guys get thanked enough, because what you do is not easy, and I recognize that. So thank you for serving our community. I do want to walk us through just sort of the overview today and what we're going to do. My role is going to be a little more about the timekeeper today than anything else. That won't work. That's better. As Deborah said, the session objective today, we want to share a lot of information. So that's why my role isn't so much about.
He's going to give you a mic to hold while you do that so you can get picked up. There you go. Don't pull too much, who knows?
Okay, is that better? Is that better? Now I'm tired and I can't move. I hate that. So the things we're trying to do, share a lot of information. Again, so that's why my role is a lot about timekeeping. And then discuss the challenges and opportunities. And again, your discussion, and I'll try to manage the time on that. Any questions on us?
See, the Vanna White thing doesn't work with a microphone.
So the first thing we're going to do is go around and do introductions. And I was really asked to make sure that, yeah, if you don't mind putting that on that wall, that would be great. We want to make sure that we don't get anybody to cry. Okay, that was the big thing here. So I really had to stretch myself and come up with those questions that don't get too deep. But first of all, your name and your role. And by the way, staff, I'm warning you now in advance, I'm coming back to you to ask you the same thing. Okay, so you're participating in this morning as well. Your name, your role, what was your first W-2 job? Okay. So again, you know, Ed Manning, I'm your facilitator today. I'm Executive Director for Leadership Asheville. My first W-2, I cut a lot of grass and worked with my brothers in yard work for years as a teenager. My first W-2 job was Burger King. I made it 2 weeks. And then I moved to high-class Greece. I went to the Sizzler Family Steakhouse. But literally after 2 weeks, my mom told me that you have to take your clothes off in the garage and don't bring them in the house, especially the shoes. And then the real question I want to ask you is, why are you here? And I don't mean, well, because it's a called city council meeting, I'm on city council and I need to be here. Why did you choose to run for office? What was the impetus and why do you serve, given that it is not always a thankful job? And I know they pay you really, really well, but other than the pay, that was a joke. Staff members, same thing. Why did you choose to work for the city of Asheville? There's plenty of other jobs out there that probably pay a little bit more. But what's the real reason behind that? Okay. So think through that, and then I'm going to start over here. Keith, are you okay going first? Take your time. I want people to really think about why they're doing what they're doing. Right? If you need the time to write it down, do that.
So you want to do the whole, everybody here and then the staff too?
And then we're gonna have the staff stand up and do them as well.
Okay, and you want it to end by 10:15?
Yes, and so it's gonna be a quick one. This is not long, lengthy, you know, I was born in, yeah, this is a short. Yes, 30, so I just demonstrated. My name's Ed Manning. I'm the facilitator today. My first W-2 job was Burger King. And the reason I'm here is that I really do love serving and facilitating. And I want to see our community continue to grow and develop. Done. Next. See how easy it is? Okay, Keith, you ready?
Yes.
Fire.
All right, my name is Keith Young, council member. My first W-2 job was a busboy at Steak and Ale, making $3 an hour. And why am I here? I'm here to try to represent folks who cannot be here. That's it.
Good, thank you.
Shanika Smith, council member. My first job was Hillcrest Enrichment Program. I was a camp counselor. I'm here to keep communities who feel displaced or lost in the game.
Great, thank you.
I'm Julie Mayfield. I am a member of City Council. My first W-2 job was as a hostess at my local neighborhood Italian restaurant in Atlanta. And I'm here, I ran 5 years ago now, whenever that was, because I thought I could be helpful and have an impact.
Good morning, my name is VJ Kapoor. I'm also a city council member. My first W-2 job was as a municipal employee in the Parks and Rec department of the township I lived in up in Pennsylvania. I am here, I really ran to improve the day-to-day lives of people. I've said that I've ran to make sure that every resident goes to sleep each night feeling safe, fed, healthy, and valued.
My name is Brian Haynes, City Council. My first W-2 job was a dishwasher at the Holiday Inn on Tuttle Road. Why I'm here, I sometimes wonder. But I really just wanted to give a voice to people that don't necessarily have one.
Gwen Whistler, member of City Council. My first W-2 job was I worked at a paint store, mixing paint, and realized that I'm really sloppy, so I ruined a lot of clothes. Why I'm here, when I first ran, it was just, I felt like I could bring my background in business to help.
My name's Esther Mannheimer, and I, of course, babysat forever and ever, but then my first W-2 job was scooping ice cream at Baskin & Robbins, which probably dates me a little bit. And why am I here? Well, I love everything municipal. I clerked for the city in 1997 and loved it ever since, and I hope that I'm helping make it better in Asheville.
Go ahead.
Good morning again, Deborah Campbell. My first paid job was actually an internship with the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Regional Planning Commission, and that's where I fell in love with the field of urban planning. Why am I here? Maybe I'll speak from the perspective of just in public service, not in Asheville. My parents died when I was young, and so many people helped raise me that public service is the way that I feel like I can give back.
I'm Brad Branham, city attorney. My first W-2 job was a surveyor's assistant, which sounds fancier than it was. I held the pole. I'm here because law is my passion, and this gave me a way to use that and work on the cool stuff and for the city that I live in, which is just to me, so far in my career, the very best way to use it.
My name is Kathy Ball. I serve as the Assistant City Manager for the City of Asheville. My first W-2 job was Pizza Hut, and I was not very good at it and figured I really need to go to college. And I am in public service because I'm fundamentally wired to want to help people.
I'm Richard White, Assistant City Manager. My first job was at McDonald's, and I was terrible at flipping burgers, so I got to work in the drive-thru as cashier. I'm here because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to be here to work on behalf of my hometown to help move the city forward.
My name is Mandy Carlson. I'm city clerk. My first job right out of high school was at the FBI. I know, I didn't know McDonald's. I know I felt bad for saying that after all those. And I'm still packing. And I'm here because I like structure and I like to
Amen, you do. As long as it's in by noon.
As long as it's what?
In
And
by
I like
noon.
to be able to help people navigate government because I know it's sometimes hard to do.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, so top that.
But we are going to start back here in the corner. If you're not city staff, please stand and just quickly answer the questions.
Beth Beagle, Communication Administrative Manager in the Finance Department, first W2 job, softball coach. Love helping people, love making things fun.
Thank you.
Sarah Milliger, Deputy City Clerk. My first W2 job was a local ice cream shop. I too enjoy structure, and I'm learning a lot more structure. But really, public service is my calling, so looking for.
My name is Jamie Matthews. I work in the city manager's office. My first job was a summer camp counselor at the Fayetteville Water Community. I'm here to really love working on a team, and we do work as a team together for our community. So,
Barbara?
I'm Barbara Whitehorn. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the city. My first W2 job was working at Pasta di Salazzi, which was an Italian deli in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I actually worked there on and off for 7 years all the way through college. So, love that. And I am here in a broad sense because I'm passionate about public service and in a more specific sense, just of this community. I'm Dalla Hitch, and I'm the Communication Public Engagement Director for the city. My first job was delivering newspapers on my bike, where I grew up in Virginia. And why am I here? I'm here because I am passionate about creating opportunities for people to come together. I think that's where the real magic is, and that is how we are going to realize the best community that we have.
Ben Woody, Development Services Director. My first W2 job was food line. However, I was not able to join the Salisbury Millionaires Club for food line. I'm just signed up to public service to select Kathy as part of our community. Chief Memphis Capital Projects Director. First job was I was doing the dirty work in a private repair shop, so to allow you to shine. The reason I public service tonight, there's a kind of always an interesting challenge, like trying to problem solve Moving to Alpine Department, first W2 job, any of you old enough to living in the Chapel Hill area in the late 80s, early 90s, might remember a restaurant called Darryl, 15501 between, you remember? Yeah. So I worked there as a waiter. That was my first W2 job. Why do I do what I do? I've been doing budgets for the city actually for about 18 years now. Love working in budget. We get to work with all these folks all across the departments. So in the morning, we might be working on an issue in the fire department and talking about staffing in the station. In the afternoon, we might be working with HR and talking about implementing a plastic concept. So we get to do it all. That's
Any other city workers? Did I miss anybody? Great, thank you. Thank you for joining in. Just, what'd you notice?
We all started in, not we all, food service.
There's a whole lot of us from food service.
Service.
I noticed that as well. I was surprised by how many. And the passion. The passion for the city and
Building a community that thrives for everybody. Okay? So you've already been through the agenda, so we can skip through some of this stuff pretty quickly. Real quickly, this table here, council members, I know you saw it very, very briefly, but in terms of what you saw from last year's accomplishments, what's the one or two that you're really proud of that we've accomplished?
Or can we just say, even if it's,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, I'm very proud that we've broken ground on the Lee Walker redevelopment.
Great.
I'm proud that we funded most of the first year of the transit master plan. I'm not proud that we weren't able to do all of it, but I'm proud that we were able to do a big piece of it. 25% increase in service is, in 1 year is huge.
Yeah, good.
So just really quick, I'm getting some text from folks watching in the audience. Unless you talk into the mic, they cannot hear you. So I hate to bug you, but I'm gonna, just because people are sending me notes that are trying to watch.
Right.
I'll include, one of the things I'm really proud of is the fact that we've got a multi-year financial plan that we'll be looking at later today. It's a really good job that folks have done, and I think it'll help us with a lot of the discussions we have today.
Good.
I'm excited about strengthening our partnership with Asheville City Schools. And we have a funding source that can help communities also help us close the achievement gap.
Good.
I'm proud that we hired Deborah Campbell.
Yeah.
They're
They're happy too. Any others? Okay. So you've already seen the agenda, so I don't really need to go through this one so much. Any questions on the agenda? We've got that. Lastly, some guidelines for operating today. First of all, take care of your needs. You're all adults. If you are cold, you can ask, we can try and flip the switch on and off. But if you need to get up and go to the bathroom, help yourself, please do. If you need more coffee, get that. Just take care of your needs, okay? And if somehow you can't or you need help, please ask. And we're here to help. Secondly, respect others. Okay? Respect the folks here, each other, what they have to say. And a lot of that has to do with listen with empathy. Okay? So empathy is really trying to understand where somebody's coming from. That does not mean you have to agree with them, but at least understand where they're coming from first. Maybe even acknowledge where they're coming from and then disagree respectfully. Contribute to the collective wisdom. And we want to hear from you as well. Put it in there. And can we all silence your cell phones, devices, computers, any other thing? And then lastly, be present. Part of the retreat is to actually be here, so we need your involvement in that. Any questions on these? Anyone you want to add? Any to take off? Can you live with and support them? I'm looking for a head nod. Yes. Great. Can we post these?
on the wall.
Yep.
Is that what you mean?
All right, and with that,
we are going to transition into our first topic, the budget overview, right?
Well, actually, we're going to have an economic and demographic overview by a guest speaker, and I will do a little bit of an introduction. We are getting ready to dive in, so get ready. We thought that it would be good to start our conversation with kind of pulling up, and then we're going to really drill down into, the business of Asheville, but we just thought that we could maybe just look at what's happening within our community as it relates to economic and demographic trends in the city of Asheville. And to do that, we have Tom, and I may just butcher his last name, but I think it's Tavit? Tavit? Okay, I knew I would do it. And you all have his bio in your packet of information, but let me just give you just a little bit of information about him. Tom is a research economist and president founder of Seneva. Did I get that one right? Okay, great. Economics LLC, and the tag line is Understand Your Economy. Tom's broad portfolio includes economic assessments for dozens of communities nationwide, industry targeting, economic impact analysis, workforce and skills assessment, micro-demographic analysis, and a host of custom analysis answering specific site and client needs. Mr. Tavit, clients includes commercial developers, chamber of commerce, community groups, architectural, and planning firms. Tom currently teaches the Applied Analysis course for Council for Community and Economic Research in Arlington, Virginia. And Mr. Tavit has a bachelor's in Science and Economics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's of Business Administration and Finance from California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I wash dishes at Chuck Wagon Restaurant in Santa Barbara, California.
All right.
I wanted to say that. So driving in here this morning, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. I should say that I have lots of corporate and community clients, and I'm always really appreciative of the fact that they pay me to tell them just data truth. And sometimes that's not easy. I suppose should not have an opinion, really. People hire me to just interpret the data and to make better decisions, basically, and understand what's going on. So thank you for having that. Thank you for being courageous and asking me to be here. Driving in this morning, these are strange and unusual times, and I thought of a story that I heard, a true story, from somebody you probably know, Brittany Bradley, from the Henderson Partnership for Economic Development, Henderson County. She said they paid a presenter like myself to come in and give a presentation on their economy, a young woman, and she was a few minutes into the presentation and the audience was squirming and talking to each other because something just didn't seem right. And finally, somebody had the courage to raise their hand and say, your data doesn't look at all like our data. And come to find out, this poor woman had put data together for the city of Henderson, which is outside of Durham, and they were in Henderson County. So the poor woman had all the wrong data. And the reason I say that story is anybody that follows the economy or follows the news will tell you that there's a big elephant in the room that we can't measure, and we're all thinking about it, and it's going to affect your planning, and that's the coronavirus. And I just want to bring that out. I've had several clients call me in the last week and say, so what's the data say? And I tell them what I'll tell you, there is no data right now for us to make decisions with. So congratulations to you that are having to make decisions without any data. And it shows to me how critical it is to have data to provide some guard. A pre-coronavirus economy and a coronavirus economy, and then a post-corona economy. And I think we're all hoping that middle economy will be short and quick and over, and then we can return to some of these trends that I'm going to be talking about. So with that being said, let me jump right into it. This is a lot of data, a lot of numbers. I tell all my clients, and I'll tell you the same thing, interrupt me if you don't understand it. Sometimes these are cute and clever charts that I think say something, and it might not be there, so please don't hesitate to interrupt me. So here's what we're going to go for really quickly. If it feels busy in town, it's because it is or it was. The city reigns as the center of commercial activity for the region. That's important to remember. Sometimes you may take that for granted. Somebody like me is an outsider. I appreciate that. You've had an incredible employment surge, but population growth has been tempered. Industrial diversity, you might be surprised, has flourished in the city of Asheville. And you're attracting people to your community, and this is true, that other communities would die to have. You may think of it as something that you have to deal with, but I can tell you, working with other communities, and we'll get into it, You have people that want to live here and are living here because they want to, and they are people that other communities are paying marketing firms to go out and find, and they're coming to you for free. And there are obviously some difficult disparities that remain, especially in terms of earnings and income. So let's just look at, this is resident employment. This is employment by residents of the city. We'll talk about all those other folks, and we know who they are in a minute, but this is the employment totals. And what you'll see there, I don't know why the dates are not showing up in the bottom there.
They're not on
Is there a way to,
it's not on the printout one either, so it must not.
really? Well,
Just make
it's-
it up. Just make
It's
Give us a general
2012 to 2000, this is gonna be very interesting. This is the total employment numbers.
Tom, hold on.
You got Google Slides perhaps and Microsoft PowerPoint, that maybe was, we opened the slides in Google.
We have an IT person. Can we just?
These are just regular old PowerPoint, Microsoft.
So you have the file. Is the file available?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because the numbers don't look like they're on any of the slides.
Yeah, that's gonna be kind of tough.
Yeah, yeah, 2-minute break.
To everyone, your, what would you call it, personal, or your personal, take care of your needs. Everyone, take care of your needs for 2 minutes.
And that
Yeah.
is. That would be nice. That is the PB.
Thank you.
Team Asheville.
Can you get copies of the slides too? That is kind of tiny.
It's right there. Okay, that's where, see where Dan is? I do see where.
He was frying fish at Captain D's. That's his first job.
What is your job? Buying fish at Captain D's.
Yeah.
Frying fish.
You ready to go? Okay, I got numbers. I can't do without numbers. That would have been really weird. Anyway, so this is total employment by residents, those folks that live in the city of Asheville. They may not work in the city of Asheville, but the point of the slide is, very simple slide, is it's been growing. It's been growing for 120 straight months employment in the city. I didn't go back any further, but I'm going to say that that may be a record. You've experienced or been experiencing an incredible period of growth, employment growth. Here it is. I'm looking at each bar here as a month, looking back at the previous month of the year prior. This is to avoid any sort of seasonality. And look at the numbers of net new jobs. So you can see you're looking at 2,000 or so jobs growth. And you can see 2019, what a boom that was, as well as the year before. And here's to look at those same numbers one more way, and this is doing it in percentages. And this is compared to the state and the nation. So that 2019, the average growth rate for employment in the city residents was 4%. North Carolina was about 2%, and nationwide 1%. So you were growing about 4% or 3 percentage points higher than the nation. An incredible amount of job growth.
Tom, quick question. The big spike, would that be like October? Is that our big tourism?
Well, this is November here, so we could, or December, I'm sorry. So middle of the year.
Summer.
But there again, you're looking back to the same month prior to this previous year. Good question though. And you can see there's a little drop down. There's always drop down between the years, January-ish. And unsurprisingly, when we look at unemployment rates, here's unemployment rates for city residents, 2.5% in this past November. And the only time we ever hit that before was back here, and I think it was October of 1999. This represents about 1,400 people looking for employment, unable to find employment. At the peak, we were looking at nearly 4,000 people looking for employment and unable to find. So what does that miss? That misses the 75 or 76% of workers working in the city that don't live in the city. So just 24%, that was prior slides, that just counts a quarter of the people working in the city. So an enormous amount of people drive in every day to work in the city, composing 76% of all employment, which by the way is what an urban area is supposed to do. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So what I did here, I looked at the most recent data we have for the city, and I zeroed out 2012 to 2017 and said, where was the job growth in the area? So it was 10,608 jobs were in the city. This is people living, working, and commuting into the city. In the entire 4-county metro area, the job increase was 8,609 jobs. And if you look at Buncombe County, without the city, it's only 4,164 jobs. And I have a graphic here that plays that out. So 55% of the net employment growth in the entire 4-county metro area occurred in the city. Or, one more way, 72% of Buncombe County's employment was right here in the city. Now, number one, that's why it's so crowded. That's why it's so busy. It's not just tourists, it's employees coming into the city. One of the problems a lot of communities have is they have a hard time keeping an urban core, meaning their cities kind of flake out. They disperse, and there is no there. And you say, where's downtown? And people kind of look at each other and go, well, we got an old downtown here, we got a strip mall out here, we got a commerce park over here, and it's very diverse, and it's not a good way to grow. One thing that we have, and I say we, meaning the Western North Carolina, is we have a strong urban core. And so you are that, and you have all the challenges and opportunities of that. But we benefit. I live in Haywood County, and we all benefit. The entire region benefits because this is an established, growing, vibrant urban core. And that's important for companies, and that's important for employees, and that's important for residents to have a good, strong urban core. So thank you for that. I know that a lot of your challenges come from that burden, but that's important, and for economic development, that's highly critical to any community. And you're doing it, and it's working right. So what about the jobs in the city? Where are they coming from? Well, unsurprisingly, you can see that accommodations and food services are out front, 32 or almost 33 net new jobs. But I think, to me, the more important facet of this chart is how many other industries are growing. So of the 17 different industry classifications, 13 are growing jobs in the city. They're not all just restaurant and hotel jobs. They're across the whole board. And for example, if somebody had asked me 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, if manufacturing would even be in the city, I would say no way. And here it's saying that manufacturing has increased by 21%. You got a net increase of 735 jobs. Those are well-paying jobs. You have professional and scientific and technical services up 612 jobs. That's about a 16% increase. And I know those jobs came down in the recession or returning. But there's a lot of different industries, a lot of different diversity that's happening within the city, and good, strong growth. Now, I know you're going to ask me, what about educational services? Educational services, they peaked in about 2011, and for whatever reason, they've been slowly dropping. And I really can't say why, but that's not just within the city, that's in the entire metro, and that might perhaps be in the state as well. So the top 5 industries, or top 4, I'm sorry, the top 4 ones account for about 64% of all net new jobs. So those are your drivers. This is a bubble chart I do for every community, and I have to explain what it shows, but I think you'll appreciate it. So at the bottom, horizontal, is just the net employment change. You saw that previously. The bubble sizes are the number of employees. So right now, I'll tell you that healthcare is your largest industry. I think there's 21,000. This is as of 2017, so it's probably even more. Accommodations and services, second largest. I think there's about 15,600 jobs. And then you can see the other smaller bubbles as you look across the chart. Now, what's probably more interesting to me is the vertical axis is specialization, which means your concentration of those industries relative to the nation. And you say, so why is that a big deal? Every community, every economy, every city, every county specializes in a few things. And that means they do good at that. And that means there's an infrastructure that is built around that supports that industry. And you can probably figure out what that infrastructure is. And you can see your highest one is accommodations and services. And we all know there's a whole infrastructure. There's a culinary at Buncombe, AB Tech. There's a lot of different things that feed into that. And usually what you do when you go with the community, you say, this is the card you've been dealt with. You can fight and scream, but this is it. And you're doing this because of a reason. There's some reason that we all know accommodations and services, because look out the window, it's a gorgeous place and we all love it and we like people to come visit here. Healthcare, because we're regional. This is a regional service center for probably 16, 17 counties for higher end services. And on you go. Now for economic development, this quadrant down here, the bottom right hand is your developing industries. So if those little bubbles grow, and they grow faster here than they do nationwide, you would actually see them move up and become specialized. So in economic development terms, you kind of build on here. Now, one thing I want to point out, and I've done so many of these charts, you've got nothing here. So that means you're not losing any jobs where you're really good at. That's important. So I've been in a lot of communities and all the bubbles are over in that corner. So they're really good in, say, manufacturing, but they're losing jobs in manufacturing. And so they're really struggling. So this is an incredible chart because you have things that are working, that you're doing good at, and then you have things that you have opportunities. It's almost all on the right side of the growth, and it's either specialized or getting to be specialized. Yeah.
What is administration services?
Temp agencies, I know that's not the popular term, but temporary employment agencies, which have really boomed in the last decade, just as companies look at ways to hire people and to, because there's not enough permanent people out there. That's a good question. Anything like that? So here's the same chart, and the only thing here that changes is instead of specialization, we look at average monthly earnings. There's the Buncombe County average monthly earnings, and then above there is North Carolina's. So what does this say? Anything below that number are earnings below the average. So across the board, relative to Buncombe County, 50% of the net new jobs have been below the average. Now, you say 50% below the average, that's what it's supposed to be. Well, that tells me that the needle didn't move. All those jobs came in, and a job is a job, but they didn't push wages up. Wages just kept the same. Now, you look at relative to North Carolina, 73% of all net new jobs paid less than the average earnings statewide. So we're not catching up. We're just flatlining as far as wages. That's nothing new. I've been looking at this economy for, I guess, a little over 20 years. I started out at the Chamber of Commerce, and that was something I figured out really fast. There's a problem with wages here.
So are you saying the new jobs that we've seen in the last 10 years or so are, tell me how it's relative to the statewide net change? I didn't quite understand that. Are we the same, about the same, or below? Or
Below.
So our net new jobs pay, average pay, that's below what the net new jobs statewide are paying?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's what you're saying?
Yeah. And I'm saying that the new ones were 73% of those jobs are below the
Okay,
the
so that
state
wasn't,
average.
oh, okay, I thought
So
you meant
you're
that
actually-
statewide. You mean that
If
locally?
I put the wages of the city, I could have done it a different way. It would show that wages are going up, but they're not keeping up, and the difference between the state and
It's
and
growing.
Buncombe County is widening,
Okay.
not keeping up.
And I have a question, not about your slides, but are these slides on our website? I just got a text from someone.
They are.
Okay, so people who are watching,
They can find it.
They can find it on the website. Okay,
Right
great.
on it where it's, the city council agenda page.
Okay.
Yeah, they
With
can
the
only
numbers?
see the.
Okay. Okay. All right.
And I will bring up something that I always run into, and Deborah ran it with me. I don't like to write on the charts what they mean, because it makes it for a better presentation. But sometimes when they have a life of their own, they sort of get interpreted independently. So just FYI. Here is something that I thought was fascinating. The data source, by the way, that I was using before is a relatively new one, and it ties your social security number in with your employer's ID, and so they can actually follow people, and you can follow ethnicity and race as well. And so this is the first opportunity I've ever had to look at the growth in employment amongst race groups. And I think the important thing is that in the bottom, the percentages. These are net new jobs by race or ethnicity. And I wanted to point out, black employment increased 29% versus white, which was 11%, Asian 28%, and Hispanic 39%. So my takeaway for that would be that this is an economy that is growing, and not only growing, but it's had participation from minority groups as well. Because a lot of times you hear about communities where there's growth, but it's unaffected by different minority groups. This is a little closer to home. This is percentage change monthly, year-to-year gross sales tax collections, Buncombe County, the monies that come back, and it's the trend that I wanted to point out. This 1% drop that occurred in March, was the first percentage decline in 62 months. Now, I've seen this in the metro numbers as well, and a little bit not as much in the state numbers. Not sure why, but if you're doing any planning and you're basing it on retail sales, there's a decline going on. It might be more of a structural, it might be because more people are shopping online. I'm not sure, can't really explain it, but you should know that it's definitely a decline. And I would imagine, especially as we go into this new economic phase, I would not be planning on increases in retail sales.
Does that include restaurants and bars, or is that just?
Any taxes on the food taxes, yeah.
Except,
It's anything that you're going and buying.
Yeah, that's taxed.
That's
that's taxed.
Yeah.
So would it,
Might be a Tony question here pretty
yeah,
soon.
yeah, that's subject to the state sales tax.
Yeah.
And we do have a little bit of discussion about the drop in the sales tax.
Right, because
As part of the budget presentation.
part of our revenue makeup is
Yeah.
some tiny portion of the local sales tax revenue.
And then another close number, this is the value of new city permitted construction. And it's hard to, construction permitting is real spiky. In fact, if you noticed, you said, well, how come I started at the second quarter of 2017? It's because the first quarter had Mission Hospital $240 million. It would put through the roof here, the bar would go up. But I wanted to show you that it's been relatively consistent, and probably more important, a close look would show that residential permitting, the value of residential permitting in 2019 was down by about 7% versus the prior year, but probably more importantly, and you can see it with the big yellow bar part there, commercial was up 36%, about $47 million. So again, it's hard to say what's going to happen tomorrow, but you've just experienced a period of very strong commercial building development, probably some of it which is still happening. And here's just permit number of units. There's really not a whole lot I can say here. Residential, you can see multifamily and single, and you can see actually how consistent it's been over at least these last 3 years. I've done some work, not for the city, but for the larger metro area, looking at permitting, and we had a period when the recession where there was very little permit activity, and at least for a few of these years, probably 2017 and 18, maybe not 19, we were just catching up to all those years where we didn't have a lot of residential construction. So you made it through the economics part. Looks like everybody's still there. Again, incredible time, a lot of boom, huge growth of employment along the way. So this is just a few demographics. You know, when you get into demographics, you could spend days looking at this and that. There's so much interesting about it. One thing about demographics, you know, demographics, it doesn't go away overnight. Jobs can disappear, industries can pack up and move away, new industries can come in, but usually your demographics are pretty stable. I'm going to talk about people moving into the area, but you're sort of, again, you're sort of stuck with what this is, and in your case, as you'll see, you've got some good things going on with your demographics. Here's the annual population growth rate. Let me explain to you what we're looking at. It's just the annual growth rate each year. Instead of a bar, I did a line, and you can see the red line is the city, and you can see that a few years prior, you were booming. 2016, the city population grew by 2% annually. That was a net increase of about 1,800 new residents. Right now, you're at 0.7%, which is an annual increase of about 650 people. So that's been that way for the last couple of years. So that pressure, that surge of new residents coming in that you may have felt earlier, the foot's off the gas right now for that. Now, I will tell you, I looked back 20 years, and the average annual population growth rate for the city is 0.9% over the last 20 years. So this is more irregular. If you looked in the 1990s, you have about 5 years where you were losing population, which is a scary place to be. You're not there, obviously, anymore. And then you can also...
Can you tell us why it would be scary to lose population, since we have a lot of constituents that think it would be great?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to. And I tell, once in a while I'll get a community. In fact, I did a presentation, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago, in Haywood County where I lived, and it filled a huge room up, and they were so excited. And at that time they were losing population, and it just sucked the wind out of the whole room, and they still talk about what a horrible presentation I gave. They do. Well, economically, it's a disaster because no firm wants to build or expand or plan new operations in a community that's shrinking. And it's sort of like the virus, it just trickles its way down. If you don't want to grow, then you don't want to grow, then I don't want to grow, and your town can just sort of implode upon itself. It's sort of self-perpetuating.
And Tom, this is net inflow and outflow, right? So
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
people in minus people out.
Right, absolutely. Good point. I have a couple other slides that break it up a little bit. But this is important for you to know, and I have some ratings and rankings just so you see where we're at here. These are the 15 largest cities in North Carolina, and you can see where you rank there. And you can see, comparative to some of the other bigger cities, these are not the fastest growing. I just did a project in Knightdale, which is south of Raleigh. They're growing at about 10% a year, and they're panicking because they don't have the infrastructure to support that.
The fastest growing areas are suburbs of the largest
Absolutely.
cities in North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, outside of Raleigh. They're just
Absolutely.
seeing The biggest boom, that double
Absolutely.
digit, yeah.
They're commuting communities. They don't have downtowns at all. They're struggling. They're struggling to build something, but you don't want to be there. But I think more interesting is these are the regional towns and the growth rate. And I know looking back the last decade or so, the city was usually ranked between the third and the fifth every year. Third, fourth, fifth, always at the top. So the storyline, and this was a national storyline, was people were moving into the urban areas. And that was even a global thing. And that actually switched last year, not just here, but it switched all over the world and the nation specifically, that people weren't madly going to urban areas as they did before. Can't really tell you why that is. But there was a reason. There was a definite switch. So people are still moving here. And I should have said that our population growth is 90% plus due to people moving in, which is another thing rather unusual about this area. It's not babies being born over deaths. It's people moving in. It's attracting new people. So you can see the other communities, I don't know what they have in common. I think for some of those communities, like Clyde, I think that's probably the first time Clyde's ever seen that sort of growth rate before, which is interesting. So it's a transformation. Which to me tells me to you don't have that. You have the pressure for employment, but you don't have that pressure for population. And this has been going on for 2 years, so it's not just a blip. It's actually some consistency to it.
I mean, Tom, would this be related to the fact that Asheville is just becoming more and more unaffordable? I mean, everybody flocked to downtown. Everybody wants to be downtown. Supply and demand. We don't have.
Yeah, that
all
would
much
be
housing
an
down.
opinion. I don't have the data,
Okay.
but that makes sense. If someone asked me, why do you think this is? I would say, well, maybe because they can't find an affordable place, and all they got to do is drive out to Clyde or Canton or something, and So, and that's a natural thing. There again, that happens everywhere, and it might not be a bad thing. Here's where we get into, so what's behind this? And this is sort of an interesting data source. This is the census, and they ask the people, they say, did you move? Yes, no. Did you move from within the county, outside the county, different state, and abroad? And I broke it down by age because that's where it really pops out. 47% of the net new increase is millennials. That's ages 20 to 34. And when I first moved out here and got a job doing research for the chamber, my tagline or my story was, it was all about baby boomers. This place is baby boomers, baby boomers, baby boomers. And it was all the services and demands that went behind that. Well, guess what? That's not happening here anymore. I will tell you that it's still happening in Henderson County, and it's still happening outside of the city, and it's still happening in Haywood County where I live. But you are blessed with attracting millennials in the city. And it's pretty significant, and it's distinct.
You should tell us why that's a blessing. I know what the answer is, but
Well, I
from
mean,
an
the good part,
economy
I'll tell you, the good parts is employers love
Right.
millennials.
If you want to see strong economic growth in a community,
Yeah.
you need workers.
And these are young workers that are establishing their roots. And I think importantly, these are people that have made a decision to be here. They did, a lot of these, obviously, none of these people grew up here. They said, I can move anywhere I want. I'm going to pick that place where I live. Now, I will tell you one of the obvious things when you talk about affordability, these people have affordability issues everywhere. They're going to have an affordability almost any place they live. Now, you're getting stuck with it, and you're going to have to hold their hand throughout their residency here because of who they are and where they're at.
So Tom, go back real quick. So this is percent-wise, right?
Yeah.
And is this percent off the group? Or so if we were to look at absolute numbers, would the 20 to 24 years, would that be the most number
Yeah.
as well? Okay, so this is percentage
Of all the
total.
people moved in,
Okay,
according to
okay.
this survey.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
It is a survey. Some of these numbers I always tell, don't fall in love with any of these exact numbers, but they're about as close to real as we can get.
So if we look at that in terms of absolute numbers as well, the absolute numbers would be of ages 20 to 34.
Yeah.
The most number is coming in
Yeah,
that group as
50%,
well.
yeah, good question. So this is another way of looking at that same thing I put in there, the millennial bubble. This is the percentage of employment, which we total up this all, each line to be 100%. And I thought I'd put the nation and the state in there, and then I'd put Buncombe County in there without the city. And obviously, the most important thing is, here's that millennial bubble, which is significant. The county doesn't have it, what I thought was fascinating. So millennials are not going to the county outside the city. Here's those baby boomers. Remember them? So they've worked their way down here. They're going to drop off here. And
How
go.
come they drop up and then they go right back up?
Well, these are people that probably came here. You know, I would say convalescent hospitals, maybe, that sort of thing.
because also of
I'm
our
guessing.
healthcare. Yeah.
I'm guessing. But you can see a difference between you and the county. You can see, here's your little baby boomer bubble, which is, you picked up an older age. Buncombe has a lot more. But I thought it was interesting that Buncombe, outside of the city, didn't pick up a lot of baby boomers. It's you. It's Haywood Road. That's kind of the way I like to visualize the baby boom, or the millennials.
So what's interesting about that to me is that, what that says to me is that young people actually are finding a way to live here.
Yeah, they obviously are, yeah.
I mean, not
They're
that,
here.
Not that it's not necessarily a struggle, but they are not in the county. I mean, that's part of the narrative is, well,
They
people can't live
chose-
in Asheville anymore, so they're going to the county, and certainly that may be true, but this would seem to indicate that until you hit, 50 years, people are still finding a way to be in the city.
Absolutely. Well, as I said before, these are by choice. This is people that are moving into the area. They've decided to get here, to move here. My son lived in Oregon, he lived in Colorado, and lived with us in Haywood County, and now he's back living, I could almost see his house from here, and he's picked it, this is the best place he could think of living. And he's struggling to pay his rent, but this is where he wants to be.
But if I could add, I think they also, the millennials, live a different lifestyle. They will be 4 and 5 deep and to be able to share. So they live almost in a kind of a shared, a communal kind of way versus baby boomers, we kind of want our own space.
But hasn't that always been the case? I mean, when I was in my 20s, I had roommates, I had friends who lived in houses with 4 or 5 other people. I mean, this is not a new thing, right? I mean,
That wasn't my millennial.
I don't know.
Well, I will also tell you that these other groups don't move that much, period.
Yeah.
So this is when you move. You move when that millennial, and then you've got that baby boomer retirement, remember, which is kind of dropping off anyway. But that's what's driving your growth. And that, there again, we all know what it is. It's a cool city, it's a pretty city, it's a vibrant city, there's jobs in this city. So that's why they're coming here. This is all good stuff, because I hope you know this is kind of the guardrails of your decision-making going forward, because this isn't going to change. You're going to watch that little bubble your entire career work its way through this community as it ages. Unless they move out, I doubt it. So this is another chart that I looked at the earlier data. I have to explain the numbers here a little bit. But these are new resident attraction by race and ethnicity. The numbers are really high, I think, and one of the reasons is this is counting the people that are moving in. It doesn't count the people moving out. So these numbers, although they're an estimate to begin with, the other part of this slide would be, numbers that perhaps are greater on the other side for some groups. Now, the reason I show this at all is 2 years ago, Buncombe County asked me to do disparities with the white and black community in Buncombe County. And my first or second slide, which got a lot of gasp and groans, were that the black population in the county was projected to begin to decline, meaning getting smaller. And so I thought this was encouraging, that this is people that are moving to the area that have selected to come here. They say, I want to live in Asheville. So the idea that the black community is disappearing is sort of confronted by these numbers that say they're still coming in. There's still people coming in.
But we don't know if the number moving out
No,
is higher.
it still might be an overall
A net loss,
negative
a
number.
net,
yeah.
overall net loss. Yes.
But this is an opportunity. People are still choosing to come in. Now, I got maybe too clever on the next couple slides, but we'll struggle through it. Try to get as much information as I could in one slide. The way it works here is I've got two data sets that are on top of each other, but they're in each column. So, for example, Hispanic or Latino, this is medium household income. This is the percentage of households in the city, and then the median household, and then compared to the state and the nation, which is the two dark ones. And I didn't put the numbers on it because it gets a little confusing, but you can see they're relative. And what I want to point out,
Is this for Asheville or Buncombe County or?
I'm sorry, this is all for the city. This is
Just
the
the
city.
city,
Yeah.
oh, Asheville, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is all the city.
So
There's
to use an example on the right side for Hispanic or Latino, you're showing that the median household income of a Hispanic or Latino home is about the same or slightly greater than the state average.
Exactly, that's
Okay.
it. That's the
But then
takeaway
what,
right there.
and below is what percentage of the households of our total they
Exactly.
make up?
About 5%. So I've looked at this chart a long time, and there's something here that's horrific. It is black households, 10%. But let me get through the numbers here. So a black household, you can see already, the lowest household income, 30%, 31% below national, 31% below there, 45% below white, 57% below national wide. Huge disparity, 50% between national. So the other numbers, there's some drop-offs too. As you can see, one thing across all, lower here than anywhere in all categories versus the state and the nation. But we already,
And one question about relative to national, in all categories, it's lower, and is that just in general because the Southeast is lower than the rest of the nation? I mean, when I look at those statistics.
North Carolina, where is
No, I mean, but see how the dark gray bar is the highest in, yeah, right.
You're
And
right.
So just salaries in general in the Southeast
There's
trend
no-
lower.
there's no Silicon Valley or, here to, so yeah, we're always gonna be lower. The Southeast is always gonna be a little bit lower. The parts of, not this part, but some parts of North Carolina and the eastern part are much lower, but you're right. So does that make sense? There's a lot in here. I might have put too much in, but there's some interesting things. Here's another one. This is educational attainment in median earnings in the city. This one really, I looked at this data again and again to make sure I didn't embarrass myself. Look at this. I don't know if you knew this. This is 28% of the population aged 25 and over in the city has a bachelor's, 21% has a graduate or professional degree. Incredibly higher than the state of the nation. But what's the takeaway? Earnings are about, a graduate is about 31% below the nation, and bachelor's about 25% below the nation. So they're choosing to come here. They've got a good degree, and they're making the sacrifice, whether intentional or not, to take a lower paid job. There again, in terms of economic development, I'll get your question in a minute. This is fabulous. I mean, this could be on a billboard out there somewhere. You've got a very educated group. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying that's those baby boomers that retired here and got graduate degrees. So I'll get your question in a minute, Gwen. But so I looked at, you can break this out a little bit. Age 35 to 44, bachelor's or above. Nationwide, that's 37% of people ages 25 or over. It's 61% in here. And then just to take one last look, 65 and older, 28% of that population has a bachelor's or above. In the city of Asheville, it's 51%. And your question?
Wow. So are there other cities that look like this? I mean, for a while I was living in Denver, and they had this kind of flip with the same idea. People move there and they were willing to take less salaries because it was just a nice place to
Right.
live. And so, so I guess my question is do we have other cities that compare this way that look like Asheville, and, you know, so that we can kind of look to them and say, well, what are they doing to fix this disparity between?
Probably, I don't, yes. I know even the little town I just worked in, Nightdale and Holly Springs, they have something like this, but those folks are driving up to Raleigh for their employment. So there is, I can't tell you off the top of my head what they are, but it's probably, I grew up in Santa Barbara, California. They had something like this, same reason. I'd rather live at the beach in a beautiful place and make, 10, 20 grand less versus working in LA.
This, what this confirms for me is maybe some of y'all have heard the same stories, like you go into a restaurant and your waiter has a master's degree.
Right.
And they're like, well, I moved here and, I can't find a place to work or whatever, but it's kind of indicative to the slide that you had earlier about, the types of jobs that we have. We have tons of jobs, but not high-paying jobs.
Right.
And then we've got a really great educated community that can find jobs to match their qualifications. So I just know when I go sit in restaurants a lot, I meet a lot of people with high-level degrees that are waiting tables.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good takeaway. But not a bad problem to have if you can hang on to them. These are poverty rates that there's no trick with it going up and down here. I just put, this is all city poverty rates. I didn't, what did I pick out here? The only thing that's really interesting to me, actually the poverty rates, relative poverty rates are relatively low to the nation and state, which is a good thing. The only two groups that were not, which was interesting to me, was part-time workers, which may get back to yours, and white, which is only 1%, I think, difference there. But the part-time workers was the only one that really popped out that there was a difference here versus the nation and the state.
So people considered to be living below the poverty rate who are underemployed, essentially.
Right. And I think that the poverty rate, changes every year, what its actual numbers are. But for a single person, I think it's like household income of $12,700 or less. So it's not much.
But we don't have the raw numbers on these. These are percentages relative to their categories, so that we don't know, if there's 1,000 people considered to be part-time workers, or is this of the total population?
Of the total population, and there are actually numbers that go behind this, which show the number of people. This is a chart that I just wanted to do, so you've got to look at it, but it really, the only takeaway here, this is age by earnings, and this is Buncombe County, but we already decided that 70% of employment is occurring in the city anyway, so I'm sort of cheating. You can see it doesn't show up as strong as I thought it would. The percentage of employment versus the state and the nation is obviously higher in this younger age group. But the storyline for the earnings, and you've already heard this all again and again, it's lower all across the board, and it's about 25 to 30% lower in each of these categories. And none is really significantly higher or lower than the other.
But Tom, just on that, just to go back, and I realize you've explicitly told us that you're not going to speculate as to why on this, but I mean, that's sort of the big policy question here, right? If we're trying to formulate ideas to address this, and the question of why this is happening is a pretty big one for us, right? And because if you look at it and just say, look, people want to move here, right? And that's just kind of what people are willing to pay, so to speak, or willing to get. That puts us in a different spot than saying, if there's another reason. And in my mind, I'm sort of trying to rack my brain to understand that, because this is sort of similar to what, and I don't know if you guys are using the same data source, but when you all staff put together the stuff for the moratorium, I mean, one of the things that struck me was the conclusion that was made there was saying that we have a lower median income here in the city, or average, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that our professionals are actually getting paid a lot less than where they are in other parts of the state, whereas kind of, to the extent you want to say lower wage workers or are actually kind of more competitive than the higher professionals. And so, I guess where I'm trying to wrestle with, and it would be helpful if not today or sometime to get some other folks' opinions as to why this may be the case, because if we don't have a better answer for that, we're sort of struggling with what the response should be.
So when you say the question, you're talking about why overall is the average pay across the board, is what I'm hearing you say, in Asheville lower than the state average?
Right, because look what you have. You've had population growth here, right? You've had job growth here, right? You've got all those things happening that most economists would look at this and say, oh, okay, your earnings must be going up, right? I mean, that would be the logical conclusion, but they're not, right? Or excuse me, they're lower relative to other places, right? And so that's quirky. That's not something that as an economist you would expect.
Maybe you're about to tell us why this is.
They're all looking at me. It's a lot of different factors, and obviously it's not easy to change because communities would be changing. I mean, the obvious thing is to increase the education of your workforce, but you already have education. You attract industries that have higher wages. That's not always easier. It's structural. I always remember the story. The reason that when I first moved here, there were still quite a few, most of you probably remember, textile mills. Textile mills came here primarily because they were paying too high a wage in the Northeast. So they said, we can come down here and get by paying about 30% less. So, why does that work? That's a cultural thing, I suspect. People were coming from the farm to the factory, and so there was an increase. I don't think there's a simple answer. I wish there was. It's a lot of different factors. It's where you're at. It's what you specialize in. It's that industry mix as well. Let's be honest, tourism's never going to be a high-wage job. There's just not the margins in there for that. So,
I don't know, maybe I'm trying to make this too simple, but it seems to me that this has to relate to your slides about how many people are choosing to come here. And, we those of us who moved here, we all moved here. A lot of us, could be making a lot more money if we were somewhere else. So
right.
It is a choice. Maybe there are a number of factors, but it seems to me that has to be that, if not at least a central driving factor. We are willing to take less because of the quality of life.
It's a quality of life. Well, I know myself personally, Southern California,
Sure.
I probably made the most I've ever made before I moved here.
Right.
But I knew that, and I'm happy with that decision. I'm glad I made that decision.
But if there are, I think barring the the choice, I'm a lawyer. Lawyers in Asheville don't make as much as lawyers in Charlotte. I know that. I don't want to live in Charlotte. But barring that sort of self-selection, if there are things that are impacting the wages people are potentially able to earn that are solvable, should be addressed, can be addressed. That would be something that would be of interest to me. Anecdotally, my impression is that a lot of jobs are now more skilled. They require some kind of certification or some kind of basic training at AB Tech to learn how to operate some kind of system before you can get that job that might pay 40 grand a year rather than 25 grand a year. And so there are some gaps where employers need the employees, they got job openings, but they don't have a good fit with a trained or certified employee. Certainly hear a lot of that in our community. So that would seem to me to be one opportunity that our community has. The other I always hear from economists is, well, you don't have a D1 university, you don't have some of these larger institutions that might generate average higher paying jobs.
Yeah, that's possible. I should say, first of all, let me talk about employers, because if we had a group of employers, they'd have a whole different story. They would say, we can't find enough qualified employees.
Right.
Which is a different story, and that's kind of hard to make that jive as well. That clustering, what you're good at, if you've got some really high-paid industry that in that bubble chart there up in the right-hand corner, that is those, the university or something, you can build an economy if you had a huge, big university up the road. So that's a potential there as well. But that's not going to change overnight.
One thing that strikes me is when you show the slide with the demographic of the boomers and the millennials, and we have more millennials coming into our city than any other time, you mentioned that these are the individuals that are gonna continue to cross that age progression and remain in this area. I think it's a good opportunity to look outside the box and really drill down on the demographics of those age groups and what their education is, and try to create a different space for them economically. What can we do to incentivize entrepreneurship or any other types of things that will actually follow that group? So looking ahead to what we know we have that you said other communities would love to have. We have a group of young workers who may be highly educated. What can we provide as a community to these individuals to help become a catalyst of some other type of growth that moves toward the future, where these individuals are going to stay in our community and we'll be ahead of the curve of other cities? So how can we look outside of what we already have to make this group, bring us a more booming economy for other things, is the tech industry or whatever? I don't know. I'm just saying that I feel like we need to focus on that group of individuals and how can we keep them here, since that's something that everybody else wants and we already have. How can we keep them here and incentivize them in some way to become higher wage earners in whatever their profession may be or whatever? I don't know. Just kind of spitballing, thinking.
Yeah, I don't do policy, but I even thought of when I was looking at the slides, the same questions you're thinking, maybe someone should ask them, and maybe there's a way you can, get a group together and, survey a group of them and say, why are you here? What's driving you? What would make you stay? What would make you, what does the city not have that you would like? It's a tremendous potential.
I think it's interesting in the sense of, and I won't ramble on, but I think it's interesting in the sense of, when I always think of Asheville, I always thought of a retirement community, elderly individuals that have come here to live their latter years of their life, and the information that you've presented here just within the last 15 minutes has kind of turned that on its head recently, which tells me the trajectory of the city will continue to change based on the individuals that will remain here and age out through our community. So if we're not focusing on them, we're either gonna lose a great opportunity, or we're gonna see our city change in a way that we're not prepared for because we're not focusing on them.
I've done my job. I'm gonna get the hook here pretty soon, but go ahead.
Sorry,
Well, you guys are the boss, they're the bosses, so.
On that previous slide, I think people do look to us. We do get emails about, what can we do to increase wages and all of that. And again, from this discussion, it actually says to me that we have very little leverage from a policy-making perspective. What we can try to do is do things that sort of maybe bring down the cost of living, like having a great transit service so that people don't have to have a car, or building more affordable housing. We can try to bring down the cost of living, especially for that younger demographic. But and the economic development money to bring good employers who are paying more. But I don't feel like we have a lot of levers.
It's not easy. It's not easy because every community is dealing with this. Okay, I got a couple.
Something on my shoulders telling me not to say this, but I'm gonna say it. About raising the salaries of your employees. You have a lot of professional people here that are millennials that work in this city. So I'm sorry.
Are you saying for the city of Asheville to raise the city employees' salary, or are you talking to employers in the city?
I'm saying the city of Asheville, city employees.
Yep. Oh, well, luckily, that's on our agenda later today.
What a segue.
Little preview there.
Okay, last informational slide before I get kicked out of here. And this is something that you probably know as well, that there's a lot more renters here than there is at other places. And as you can see, this is so that, really briefly, this is home renters, the percentage of home renters, of total households, the percentage, and you can see renters with incomes 25 to 49 is where there's a big bubble, but there's also big bubbles of renters out in this group as well, and down here. So we could spend a lot of time talking about that. This area right here, you could split out even more. I took a look at about 11% of those making between 25 and 34,000 are in the city versus 4% nationwide. So it's a huge gap, a lot more renters in low and actually high incomes relative to the state or nation. Okay.
Yeah, and our stats are more in line with other cities that are kind of like us, very popular, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to do my summary really quick here and see if this works. Okay, employment in the city has been steadily growing since 2010. City's growth rate is above both the state and the nation. It's the lowest unemployment rate in the city in 2 decades. In-commuters comprise 76% of the city employment. 55% of net employment gains in the entire 4-county metro have been right here in the city. 72% of Buncombe counties right here in the city. 4 industries have led the city's employment growth: accommodation and services, 27% of that growth; public administration, which is what we're doing here, 50%; retail trade and healthcare, 10%. 73% of employment gains have been in industries earning below the state average. Minority populations have participated positively in the city's employment growth. Retail sales collections are trending slower. Construction permitting holds with very strong commercial activity over the last year. The city's population growth rate is slowing. There's 2 is's in there, slowing. City's attracting minority populations. The city's population has a high proportion of 25 through 29s, the millennials, and it's attracting a high proportion of 20s through 34. Significant income disparities persist, especially among Black households and the well-educated, which is an interesting combination. The city is home to a high proportion of low and middle income renting houses. So that is it. We probably don't have time for Q&A. We've had it.
One they absolutely have to get in. Great.
All right, thank you very much.
We're going to take a 3-minute power break.
No, I can't because goes in and tells me.
Yesterday that was left from the fire department.
Your computer?
Yeah.
Let me think, what did I do with it?
Yeah, because we need to give it to,
It was in
Scott.
It was in a Chromebook.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I'm gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna make sure he hears that first.
Look, it got everybody involved in it.
Now listen, I found Sanders keys Monday.
They told me.
I usually walk up the way, when I walk in, I walk in there and check TV. We don't have.
You just need to all this
It's going good. How are you? Good to see you.
Ooh, I'm so excited. I'm so glad you guys are first. On this? Oh my god, dude, oh my, I mean, right? So this is the thing, it's like, if anyone asks, why do you have a reserve? This is why you have a reserve. This is why you do it. I mean, this is exactly why you do it. Because all of us are waiting on it to do for
All
us,
done?
right? Yeah. We're on the cool, and this thing's gonna not. Thanks very much. What impact can it have on us? I don't know. Right?
That's our baby right there. That's paid off in space if you forgot it. Makes a huge difference. So, are y'all running around town? We're doing pretty much right here.
Don't worry about that. We got that.
That is Bell.
It's cold again. Freezing.
Yep. Sounds like we.
It goes all back and forth and back and forth. I mean, really, just what are those blanket things that you can wear? Those
We're not gonna give you a blanket.
No, they're the blanket, like
Maybe a
robe thing.
Snuggie?
The Snuggie, like, they should have Snuggies here that you can just intermittent.
Oh, here you go. On the side, there's an on off button. There you go. All right, now.
Or like if you have to sit all day, and your heart drops and, you're cold.
I think the only one that we're missing may be Keith. Mayor, are you wanting to wait or go ahead and get started?
I just saw him out there.
Everybody ready?
He's going to get
Only Keith is missing. We think that we can get through this next section before we break. We may need about 5 minutes, 12:05 to start lunch.
I feel like we just had breakfast.
You just had breakfast? Okay, great.
What did you say about lunch? You want to do a working lunch?
I was just saying that we can get started at 12. Maybe if you would give us to 12:05 or 12:10 for this session. Okay, let's go. All right. We are getting ready to transition into the really, really heavy lifting of discussing the budget, discussing those fairly significant initiatives and strategies and projects and things that we know we need in this community. However, we are fiscally constrained. And so this is about how do we look at, in a little bit more detail, in terms of 3 of those items, how do we look at the challenges and the opportunities? And then as we go through the budget process, there will be, some tough decisions as, again, we work through the process of adopting a budget. That presentation that you just got was really contextual. It set a framework for what's happening within our community and in our economy, both from an economic, social, economic, and demographic perspective. So we will have Tony McDowell, who is the Assistant or Deputy Director of Finance. He's going to provide you with information on the budget process. Essentially, he's going to go over the budget, the process, its context, give you a little bit more financial update information, and some of our challenges and opportunities as it relates to our budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Deborah, and good morning. As Deborah said, we're going to start this morning with the budget process context. And I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try and run through this fairly quickly. If I start going too quickly, if you have questions, please just stop. So in terms of context, before we go there, first slide. So one of the things that in working with Deborah that we really like is she emphasizes to us, start every presentation with the end in mind. And so what are the three key takeaways we want you all to walk away from after you've heard this presentation today? And then that's what these three are. We'll reemphasize this at the end. But it's the uncertain economic outlook, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that might impact revenues moving forward with the budget and also moving forward the next 5 years in the financial forecast. But to be quite honest, there's a lot of uncertainty at this point, and nobody really knows where we're headed. We're going to point out to you, and we messaged this back in January when we talked to you all, that the revenue growth for next year is likely going to be used up by all of our ongoing operating expenses that are already part of our baseline budget. And that leads into the final bullet, which is there really is a need for additional revenue if we're going to fund any new capital or operating expenses in next year's budget. So, context, where we're at. So, we've been working on the budget internally for several months now. We started back in October working on the capital budget, started in December working on the operating budget. We came to you all in January with a work session where we kind of gave you a status overview of where we're at with the current year and where we thought we were headed with the budget for next year. And we're going to update some of the numbers that we showed you all then. And then here we are today at the retreat on March 13th. So where we go from here is, this is typical of how we've done things the last several years with our budget processes. We'll have 2 work sessions scheduled with you all coming up, one on March 24th, one on April 14th, and that's all leading up to presentation of the manager's recommended budget on May 12th. And then eventual adoption of the budget on June 9th. And in between those 2 times, there will be a public hearing for folks from the community to come and talk to us and give their input. So what guides us during the budget process, and you all have seen this earlier in Deborah's presentation, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but obviously anytime we're making budget decisions about what items get funded, where we look is City Council strategic priorities, and that's where we want to put any additional revenues that we may have. We want to make sure that that money goes into addressing you all's priorities, and those are your top 13 priorities. And you're going to see later in the presentation when we talk about some specific examples of some of the requests we've gotten and how they are tied back to these priorities. And then the second sort of piece of what that provides us guidance on all this are our guiding principles, and we established these last year as we worked through the budget process. So as we look at our requests, we ask ourselves, how do they impact essential service delivery? Are we enhancing customer value with what we do? And again, are we addressing you all's strategic priorities in the decisions we make during the budget process? So I'm going to transition now into some numbers, and this is where it gets a little scary. Before I do, I was in a meeting yesterday, and I got an email that's an update to the Wells Fargo economic outlook. And I'll just read this first sentence to you. It says, in the forecast that they just released yesterday, they called for a mild recession in the second quarter of this year with a return to growth in the following quarter. And then they said, however, the events of the past 24 hours or so have made it painfully obvious that we need to rethink this forecast. So keep that in mind as I run through these numbers, because we've been working on this for the last several weeks, and things are going to change. We don't really know this at this point how much they're going to change. Is it going to be something that is long-term? Is it going to be short-term? But we're giving you all the best information we have at the moment. So when we came to you in January, and this is looking at the current year general fund budget, we gave you some estimates on revenues and expenses and also a potential shortfall in the transit fund. So we have updated those numbers for March, and you can see that there hasn't been a whole lot of movement in the kind of the top line numbers. A couple things I'll say. On the revenue side, we did get our property tax information from Buncombe County, and we did a little better this year than we had budgeted. So that revenue source is likely to come in over budget. However, and you'll see on some slides I'll show you in a bit, even before the current economic uncertainty, we had seen sales taxes starting to underperform. So we had already lowered our sales tax estimate for next year based on what we had seen through November and December. And so those two almost offset each other. So we essentially are still at the same place, right now at least, in terms of revenue estimates. Now, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about sales taxes and the difficulty in estimating those as we move through, but it is likely that number will probably come down as we move through the next few months. On the expense side, we're still essentially where we were back in January. The last thing I'll point out on this slide is where we're at with transit. So we do think the overall shortfall or the amount that's needed from the general fund has gone down a little bit, and that's primarily because we've gotten in some grants that support administration and also the paratransit and the Black Mountain route. And we met a couple weeks ago with Jessica in Transportation and our accounting division just to see where we're at in terms of timing in order to be able to draw down those grants. In other words, if we spent the money, enough of the money that we can draw down some of those grants. And we think we're going to be able to do enough with those grant revenues to lower the transit shortfall, or at least the amount that's needed from the general fund, from about 500,000 down to 300,000. Our plan with that, as we shared with you in January, is to just keep an eye on it at this point, and then come back. And if we have to do a budget amendment, it would probably be in the May or June timeframe that we would do that. We're hopeful that that gap may shrink if gas prices go down, for example. There may be some additional savings there, but we're definitely keeping an eye on that.
But just to be clear, Tony, so is that basically front-loading grant dollars we would have used in the next fiscal year to this fiscal year? Is that why it's going down?
Well, we've been looking at grant dollars for next year too. We spent a lot of time on that. We think, and we've added some of those to next year's budget projection. So I don't think it's not really front-loading. It's just the timing. I think we're going to get the same grant dollars next year. It's just the flow of the dollars, I think, has been a little quicker than we had thought. Really. So if that makes sense. Okay. So moving forward and looking at the baseline budget for next year. And we put in a little definition of baseline down here, just to kind of explain it. It's essentially continuation of current operations with revenues and expenses as they are, with, for example, no tax rate increase, no additional sales tax authority or anything like that, or any additions on the expenditure side for new services or enhancements. So this slide, we wanted to highlight on the property tax slide a few things. One being the impact of the mission HCA revenue in our budget in the last couple of years. And so this first bar is the current year budget. The second one is next year, and then moving out for the next 5 years. So what we've seen in terms of trends for our property tax revenue is about 2 to 2.5% growth over the last few years. And so we've trended that out for the next few years. But you can really see the impact of the mission money here in the last 2 years. And that's really been beneficial to our budget and allowed us to fund many of the enhancements that we put into this year's budget, and also some of the things moving forward for next year's budget as well. In terms of the impact that we might see on this from the economic downturn or potential economic downturn, again, there's a whole lot of uncertainty. If this current downturn is very short and we bounce back, chances are we're not going to see any impact in the property tax revenues moving forward. If it's prolonged and lasts longer, then we probably will begin to see an impact. It will begin it won't begin next year. It'll begin in the out years out here. And one thing to keep in mind is the property tax revenue that we'll be getting next fiscal year is based on values that are already on the books as of today. So there won't be an impact if, for example, construction slows down. There won't be an impact on property tax revenues next year. The one potential area where there could be an impact, obviously, if there's a huge downturn and folks struggle to pay their bills, then delinquencies could go up, particularly in the area of like motor vehicle taxes and those kinds of things. But we don't see that happening at this point. Okay, on the sales tax side, like I alluded to, and Tom Tavie touched upon this as well, we've seen a decline in our growth in sales taxes this year. So this is data showing the first 5 months of sales tax collections here in Buncombe County over the last 5 years, 6 years. And you can see we've had really good growth in these years until you get to this year. And we're down, so collections through the first 5 months, and again, this is through November, we're only up about 1%. We got December data a few days ago, and it was a little bit better, but now through December, we're only up about 1.2%. So that's really showing us that there is a decline in sales tax growth over the last few months. And as I said, this only covers through December. So one of the things we're going to struggle with as we move through the next few months in determining the impact of the coronavirus on our economy is the lag factor with sales tax information. We just got this week data from December, so it's going to be another 2 months to 3 months before we get the February, March data and really begin to see how the coronavirus is affecting the sales tax revenue. So you all are going to be pretty close to adopting next year's budget before we really have good sales tax information to see how it's been impacted.
Tony,
Yeah.
do we have a way to break out sales tax that's paid by people who live here and people who commute into the city every day versus tourists?
We do not. Unfortunately, and that's one of the things we struggle with whenever we're looking at sales tax data and making projections and trying to unravel it all, is that all this data is maintained by the state. And most of it's most of it's proprietary, and so they're very reluctant to share information with us about even how much specific businesses or nonprofits we're paying.
Because, I mean, my recollection from the last TDA meeting is that, you know, our visitor numbers are, as every year, they continue to go up, and so we're not, at least yet, we're not seeing any sort of dip in tourism, which makes me think this is really more reflective of people who live here spending less.
Yeah, perhaps, and we struggle to explain this as well. I talked to Tom a little bit about it before, and there really is not a good explanation for it. If you look at the state data, the statewide sales taxes through November are up about 6%. So the state as a whole is still seeing really good growth. So why ours is down? Sometimes it can be timing with submission of receipts and collections from our local vendors. So it might be that, but the longer the trend goes on, and again, we have another month now, and we're still really not up a whole lot. The more it becomes, you know, something that we think is really happening out there in the economy. All right. So moving on from revenues, and I'll just say before we move past this, we talk a lot about property and sales taxes because those are our two biggest revenue sources. Other revenues in the general fund that we might see impacted by the drop in the economy, obviously investment earnings as interest rates are cut. The yield on I think the one-year treasury note is down, so we may see a decline in our investment earnings. Development services, building permit revenue perhaps might be impacted moving forward, but I think that's more of a long-term impact. Outside of our general fund, we may see some impacts in our parking revenues. Obviously, if folks are not out and about, or revenue here at the Civic Center if events have to be canceled or folks don't show up and that kind of thing. So moving on to expenses and what's driving next year's budget. So all these numbers are approximate values of money that we are going to be adding to next year's budget to cover some of the things that are already in the baseline of operations. The first of those, and it's always the biggest number, is just a general pay raise for employees. We've been giving a 2.5% raise on July 1st the last several years, and at the moment we have that built into next year's budget. As we discussed with you all last year, the state is continuing to ask employers to put in more for the local government retirement system each year for the next several years. That's a cost of about $700,000 to the general fund. Healthcare, after several years of not having to put additional money in because of some really good expenditure trends there, expenses have pretty much caught up with revenues at this point. So even though we're still continuing to see good trends in terms of our healthcare expenses compared to the nation or the state, it's just time for us to add some more money there for that program. In the fire department, you all may remember over the last 2 years, they've had grants approved for safer grants for additional firefighters. We've added 15 firefighters. The city, that does come with a city match, and that's about $300,000 in next year's budget. And then finally, and you all will be hearing more about this in some numbers this afternoon, but we built into the budget about $300,000 to raise employee salaries to 31.2 and address some of the compression issues around that. So all told, personnel expenses next year, and this is not everything, there's other things as well, but some of the big examples total out to about $3.4 million. Some major operating expense drivers we wanted to point out to you. We've built money into next year's budget to continue the transit service enhancements that started this year in January 2020. As you all are aware, there was also some increases in our paratransit costs, as well as our fuel costs. So what that meant was to continue current operations. The general fund is having to put about $1.7 million more into the transit fund for next year. And the second one, we talked about this one before with you all, the River Arts, the Rad Tip project is finishing up. It's going to be finished soon after the start of next fiscal year. So we've added money into the budget to account for the maintenance of that new infrastructure. And then finally, the last one I would highlight, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some examples. You all aware of our CIP debt model, and each year that model requires additional investment from the city that goes up based on the value of our property taxes. And so that additional amount next year is about $800,000. So all told, on the operating side, those three examples total out to about $3 million. So where does that leave us, and again, this is, when we came to you all in January, we showed you some information, some slides, that estimated revenue growth was probably gonna be somewhere between $6 and $7 million, and expense growth for just baseline operations was gonna be somewhere between 6 and 8 million. So we've tightened up those numbers some, and so today, right now, we're looking at about $6.8 million in revenue growth for next year. And as we expected, all of that growth has been eaten up by those operating expenses that I showed you on the previous couple of slides. And then the one thing I would say again on the revenue projection is we're monitoring that, and we may have to come back and potentially lower some of the revenues, especially sales taxes looking forward to next year. But this projection was done a few days ago before we really realized the potential magnitude of what we're looking at. So I think there's a stop here. I know we're running a little bit behind, so if you all have any questions, happy to take those now, or we can just continue rolling on, and then you all can ask. Okay, I see it roll on, so, okay. All right, so a few more numbers before we get into some specific budget stuff. So 5-year forecast, some things to point out, and there's a memo that went out with the materials that has some detail on the forecast and some of the projections we use and the numbers and that kind of thing. So I'm just gonna kind of go over some of the highlights today. And obviously we've been talking a lot about the first one, the growing risk of an economic recession. Because of that, we've lowered our sales tax projections moving forward. We've also, as I mentioned, lowered our investment earnings estimates and those kinds of things. Revaluation in Buncombe County is still scheduled to happen soon, kicking off soon, and those values, which will be mailed out to taxpayers probably in the January timeframe, will become effective for next fiscal year. So as we were talking about the budget with you all next year, there'll be a discussion around how much the property tax base has grown, whether council is in favor of a revenue neutral tax rate, and so that'll be part of next year's budget discussion. We've assumed for forecast purposes that you all would adopt a revenue neutral tax rate, and so there would not be additional revenue, property tax revenue above and beyond what we would normally get. Just a reminder, Fire Station 13 construction on that new station is going to start soon. So there'll be additional staff and additional operating costs that will come with that facility once it's opened. And then we have a list of things kind of down here at the bottom that we really don't have a good number right now. And so there's no numbers in the forecast, but we know we're going to have to add those, and we know they're going to have an impact. And again, you're going to hear more about the compensation study this afternoon and the cost of implementing that. We know from what's going on out in the market that we're likely to have an increase in our recycling contract moving forward. This is the last year of our current contract, so next year, I'm sorry, is the last year, and so we're not looking at a big increase next year, but in FY22, we're likely to see an increase in our cost for recycling. We also have a lot of technology needs out there. Munis, our system that we use for pretty much everything we do in the city, we've been using that for about 10 years now, and so we're approaching a time where we're going to have to evaluate going with something else or updating Munis. And then there's a lot of other technology needs out there as well. And then, of course, you all have heard about deferred maintenance needs on the capital side as well. So because we don't really have a good dollar impact for a lot of those, they're not built into the forecast. And here are the lines again, and you're all very familiar with this. Right now, as I indicated, baseline revenues and baseline expenses are equal for next year based on where we're at. But as always, the expense trend is going to continue to outpace the revenue we have available to support those expenses. So any other questions before I move on to the next section? Yeah? Okay. All right, so challenges and opportunities moving forward. So as we've indicated, there's significant need both on the capital and operating side. So just a high-level summary, when we got in requests this year from departments, on the operating side, we got in requests for about $12.3 million of new or enhanced services above and beyond what's in the baseline budget. On the capital side, we got in requests for about $600 million. And if you all remember, when we went through this process last year, we had identified about $330 million. So the number is up, and it's up for a couple reasons. One is we just did a more thorough job, departments did a more thorough job of looking through their needs and submitting their requests this year. So we think we're getting closer to having a good number that really identifies what our needs are. And there's also been just some operating costs or some cost increases in some of those projects that were submitted last year as well. So some examples on the capital side before I move into the operating side of some of the major needs. We've identified about $2 million in kind of immediate parks, stormwater improvement needs, public safety facilities. We've identified about $10.6 million of need, and solar installations of about $4.2 million. And again, these are just some examples we picked out to share with you all.
Tony, before you change that slide, can you just demonstrate that hole is in a park right now? The site.
Yeah.
Which part?
Herb Watts.
Yeah. Yes, Herb Watts.
That's a dramatic way to highlight our need for stormwater improvement.
Yeah. Okay, and as you all know, that the cost of deferring maintenance is a lot. And so, for example, if we do an asphalt overlay or just a regular paving of a street, it's about $18 per square yard. If we wait until that street's in really bad shape and we have to do a full rebuild, it's about $131 a square foot. And then just a reminder on the sidewalk side that there's a significant backlog of maintenance that needs to be done on sidewalks as well. So kind of transitioning from capital into some of the operating needs, and what we tried to do with these next couple slides is go back to you all's strategic priorities and group some of the requests along with the priorities that they support. And you're going to be hearing more about some of these this afternoon, specifically the Transit Master Plan and the implementation of that. You're also going to be hearing some more about initiatives in the sustainability area. Waste reduction planning and staff was a request we received. We also received a request for additional resources for the city's urban forestry program. Under well-planned and livable community, we had several requests that aligned with that particular priority, including an overall overhaul of the UDO, money to support implementation of the noise ordinance, seasonal funding, shelter funding for folks experiencing homelessness, and the UNC track renovation. And then just some more examples. Again, we're going to be talking more about the compensation study this afternoon, but under financially resilient city, that's one of the examples of requests we've received. And I've mentioned some of the technology and facility needs already. Under connected and engaged community, we have requests for dollars to support what we're calling participatory budgeting through neighborhood grants. Under equitable and diverse community, we have requests for additional dollars for summer programs for youth and teens, our business inclusion training program, and request to extend hours at our community center. So, and I think I'm getting pretty close to the end, so maybe we're back on time. Key takeaways again. So going back to the beginning, a lot of uncertainty around the economic outlook, and unfortunately, we're not going to have a lot of data to know where we're headed for at least the next 2 to 3 months. So that's going to be challenging for us and challenging for you all as we go through the budget process and not really knowing where we're at, particularly with sales taxes. Now, hopefully we'll have an indication soon whether this is going to be a short-term blip or a longer-term economic issue, and I think that will help us with planning and moving ahead to next year's budget. We have fund balance. I think in a time like this, this is the time when you use fund balance if necessary. I think we've maintained a fund balance that meets our policy objective of 15%. In fact, we're a little above that right now, around 18%. So I think we're in a good position from a fund balance perspective to be able to address anything if we had to touch fund balance because of the uncertainty. But definitely a lot more data and a lot of more information to come on that. And again, just a reminder that the revenue growth that we're projecting, even in kind of a best case scenario, which is what we have programmed in right now, it's going to be used up by the operating cost increases for everything in the base budget. And we expect that growth to be around $6.8 million. And then finally, just to reiterate, if we're going to do new stuff, if we're going to address any of the high-level capital or operating investments that we need to make, it's going to require additional revenue next year to be able to do that. So I think with that, we can have discussion, and this is just, again, a reminder of the topics that we're going to cover this afternoon with you all. So questions at this point? I think I did a good job of making up some time here.
Yeah.
Very good job.
Tony, just one quick point here. in the slide that you had with first off, thank you, the 5-year forecast, again, you guys just do a really, really good job with it. I'm thankful for it as a council member. I hope the public also appreciates that many cities of our size do not do these types of analysis, and certainly not with the rigor that you all do. So hats off to you guys and your staff. You had shown that slide a little bit earlier that I think will probably become a fixture at one of these things. You had also mentioned that there's a memo here that has the number breakdown of those, and it looks as if, as you said, this year, or for next year's projection, it looks to be pretty close. You're projecting about negative 232, which is pretty close, 232,000. Years after that, we start with about a $3.2 million gap, and then grows. And to tie it back to some of the mission dollars, right? Because we may get some questions from the public. This fiscal year is the last year from the additional mission dollars, right? And we're projecting that we're ending up this year maybe to the plus side of around $600,000, assuming things don't go to complete hell.
300.
No, I think it was 300.
Yeah, once you factor in the potential transit need, yeah.
Right, I'm sorry, Glenn, that's right, including in there. But, the mission dollars are pretty much gone at this point. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I mean, you're saying additional revenues. The bottom line is, look, if we want to enhance anything here over and above what the baseline is, that puts a tax increase squarely on the table, whether that's for capital, transit, whatever we want to do. That's of any significance, that's something that needs to be discussed seriously. And that's just what the numbers show, right? It's not a policy question. That's nothing else. It's simply what the numbers show.
Yes.
And I guess I've got two thoughts in response to that. Number one, I think it's just, this is really for people listening and watching us out there. People wonder why we always go to property tax, and it's because we just don't have other options. Property tax is the big lever that we can pull. It's essentially the only lever we can pull other than fees and charges, right?
Correct.
To increase our revenue. So all of these other things that people like to talk about around a food and beverage tax and, major changes in the occupancy tax and transit tax, these are all ideas that are out there. People are working on them in different ways, but they're not going to happen this year. They may not happen next year. They may not happen anytime. And so, again, I completely agree with VJ that what your presentation tells us is if we want to do new and important things, then we need to find that revenue. And Keith and I put a proposal on the table back in January, and I don't know that we need to do deep discussion of that today. Especially since we're going to be talking about some of the key elements of that. And I think, what I do want to sort of put on the table today that we did talk about a little bit at the Finance Committee meeting last month is this idea of if we are going to be potentially increasing property taxes, what are our options around property tax relief for homeowners in Asheville who are struggling with affordability issues. And I did send out an email to Deborah and senior staff and to all of council earlier this week with a proposal around that. And if again, this is sort of a brand new conversation, and if people want to look at the presentation that the Finance Committee got last month, that is on the website under our materials for the meeting at the end of last month. But I would like to sort of put on the table for discussion now whether we would like staff to pursue a program like that and what it might look like here in Asheville. So with that.
Julie, rather than to direct them to pursue the program in anticipation of a property tax increase, could we ask the staff to at least present what the program options are to the full council, just so we could at least have a interim step of learning about what those look like? I know there's a couple of cities that are exploring implementing some kind of property tax relief for qualified property taxpayers. I'm glad to learn more about how that works.
Yeah, so maybe at the next council meeting, get for everybody the presentation that we got, and then, again, since we have some flexibility in how to craft our own program, well, maybe that's the time to have the conversation about what a program would look like here in Asheville and what kind of criteria we would want, but,
We have a budget work session on,
That would be a good
or a
time.
budget work
for the
session.
March 24th.
Is that okay with council if we hear at that next budget work session, a presentation about this program?
One other thing I just want to throw out here while we're still talking about this, I mean, on the revenue end, so there is the question of whether or not to do a property tax increase, what that may look like. There's also just the question of organic growth, right? In terms of trying to figure out what we need to do, and right, and so this is based on, Tony, this is sort of based on current as is, right? In terms of what we have. Now, you know, and this is for the public, because, you know, we hear a lot of conversations, a lot of concerns about development. We have a lot of projects that come before council, and as council members, I think all of us look at those from the perspective of, you know, do they meet the comprehensive plan and those ties? But the reality is they also have a financial impact on the city. I mean, we had a property here, Rad Lofts, earlier this week in council that passed very closely. Those types of projects here can help with some of these financial issues that we have to be able to spend in other places. And I realize, look, no council member is looking at this, you know, specifically from the perspective of how much revenue is coming to the city. That's not how any one of us looks at them. But we also, I think, have to be very honest with ourselves and not to ignore that they do have an impact, and that growth within the city and development within the city, if done correctly, will help us avoid some of the harder decisions that we're probably going to have to make this year. And we need to, I think about that as we're getting, you know, as more properties come before us.
And can I ask maybe one additional piece to the presentation that you all gave at Finance Committee about the property tax relief is, you know, what we learned in that presentation is that cities are even more limited in what they can do to help and support renters. But since then, I've learned that Durham has some sort of emergency renter assistance program, or not emergency renter, but a renter emergency rental something. So I guess because we have such a high percentage of our population that are renters, could you also take a look at that and again come and talk to us about what some of our options are around helping renters?
And I think that Charlotte has something similar to that, related to kind of an anti-displacement strategy. We'll look at that.
Any other questions?
Thank you all.
We need to clap for
Is this our lunch break? So tell me what you guys want to do. Do you want to like get your lunch and then launch into the next presentation, or do you want to go lunch? Working lunch? Working lunch? Okay, working lunch. So we'll, lunch is in there, so. So bio break and get your lunch.
So you want to just start back at noon? It's
Okay.
51 now?
Well, how about like 12:10, just because the line will
Okay,
take a little while.
that'd be fantastic. 12:10, let's start back.
Okay.
There's the structure.
Okay.
Good.
Oh, no, it has to be before noon for Maggie.
Oh, no, I'm good, just tell me what you want.
Okay. 12:10.